Hello, everyone. Hello, Paul. Hello, John. After the talk that John and Paul did in 2009 at Velocity called Deploying 10 times a day with DevOps, we thought that 2021 was a good moment to try to sit down and think a bit of what have happened these past 10 years. So we are going to look into that, but first of all, let's everyone present himself. John, can you present yourself and what you are doing these days?
Sure. My name is John Allspaw. I work with Dr. Richard Cook and Dr. David Woods, and our company is called Adaptive Capacity Labs. We've been trying to bring methods and approaches from human factors and resilience engineering to the world of software for the past couple of years. That's what we've been doing.
Thank you, John. And Paul, can you present yourself quickly?
Yeah, of course. My name is Paul Hammond. I'm the dev in the DevOps part of this equation. Since the presentation, I've been working in a number of different startups, including Typekit and Slack. I'm currently actually taking a break from full-time employment. But hopefully now the kids are back at school full-time in person, then that might start to change in the near future. It's been an interesting year for a lot of people.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And I am Thomas Depierre. I am more on the dev side, but I've spent a lot of time on the ops side also these past few years. And I will be mostly doing the host in discussion because we probably want to hear more about from John and Paul. So yeah, this talk was more than a decade ago now, right? And this was an interesting time at the time for, being in operation or even being in dev, because we were seeing a lot of change in how we were building and what we were building at the time in terms of software, right? This is approximately the kind of moment where internet was widespread enough with enough speed that we could build complicated web apps and may even think about distributing stuff through the internet. So I know we talked a bit before in discussion about how that talk was really part of that moment and trying to understand how we make that happen. So John, do you want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I think let's see. In retrospect, I think Paul and I had a pretty good handle on what we wanted to talk about at that Velocity conference. It was really just to tell a story about, hey, this is how we've been doing things, and we think it might be different than how other people have been doing it. And let's just lay it out there for you. It was quite clear, at least to me, having gone from a company called Friendster, prior to working at Flickr, things were very, very different working at Friendster than they were at Flickr. And so, contrast between those two places where I worked just stuck out at me. And, it seemed to me that, working with Paul and the way that we did things, the whole Flickr team did things, just, I don't know, seemed novel, not in a, this is the one way to do it. It was like, hey, this seems to work for us. It may or may not be interesting to you, but we're the ones giving the talk, so we'll just describe it. I don't know. Paul, is that right?
Yeah, and I don't think we expected it to resonate quite as well as it did. And I think looking back on it, it was a really interesting time in the industry. There was a kind of building awareness that the way you delivered services over the internet was different than the way you shipped software on CD-ROMs. And we were still very, very early in trying to work out what the patterns that actually made sense for that method of delivering that kind of software. I mean, we were not the only people thinking about that. I remember the day before we gave our talk, Andrew Clay Schaefer gave a talk that I saw covered all the same points, but did so in very, very different ways. But yeah, there were a lot of people thinking about the different types of software and how they were delivered. And so, I think if we hadn't given our talk, someone else would have given it 6 months later, and they'd be the ones being interviewed right now.
Agreed.
Yeah, it's definitely different these days, right? Like there have been a lot. We have figured out ways to do that, and it has changed quite a lot, right? I don't think I've worked with any company shipping CD-ROM in the past few years, right? So and that's interesting also that's this technological change, right, in our environment with all the internet and how this allowed us to distribute, have had so much fundamental change in how we operate, right, both from a dev and ops side. Do you think that this is one of these contexts that helps the DevOps movement happen, or would have it happened even in different circumstances? John?
Oh yeah. I mean, look, I think what we're talking about here is a world where you didn't have even an ability in pre-web land, pre-web world, to operate, right? You literally, on the one hand, like what Paul mentioned, you were literally shipping things. I mean, physically in the mail, or, at a store. But there was no real, the ops in that world, I guess it didn't really exist. And so when you went from a world where you're going to take your software and give it to somebody, and they're going to run it on their computer and good luck, or the world that we were in, and by the way, at the time, this was also, during the era of Web 2.0. And so it meant that, huge populations of people were adding data to these applications. But hey, we actually have access to all of the computers that run this code.
Yeah.
And so we could work out how to run the code, not just give birth to the code and, send it off out into the world. And so even the question of what's it actually doing? I mean, we know we wrote it, but that just because we wrote it doesn't mean we have any idea of how it's actually working right now or how it's going to work in the future. That sort of thing.
Yeah. And I think that was the key thing that everyone was realizing around that time, that there was this model where, and it's not just Microsoft Word on a CD-ROM, it's also Microsoft Exchange that's being run by a team of sysadmins in a data center somewhere, where the people writing the software never actually got access to the systems that it's running on. And so they didn't have that feedback loop. And we were all slowly becoming aware that feedback loop existed, but we needed to change the way we worked as a result of that feedback loop existing. And that's what John and I saw at Flickr that we hadn't seen in other places. But other people were seeing at the same time too.
Right. And yeah, it's interesting to me how I reward your talk preparing this, of course. And it's interesting how a lot of the things you present are, despite coming from a moment where we were still discovering how to do these things, are still quite applicable these days, right? Even things you mentioned just in passing, but you talk of, how important it is to have, interaction between dev and ops, but also how, it's not the code, it's not the ops, it's just DNS. I think there is a remark about DNS somewhere there, which is today a joke anyway, but it still was pretty new at the time, I think. And so it's interesting, like, how have you seen the wider community absorb this kind of technique over the years? And have you seen them re-evolve from scratch, or is it people grabbing what they could, or maybe both of that? Like, is it some things that were imposed? Like, we imposed a lot of technique over the year of teams, or is it just that these things came up because practitioners needed them?
Paul?
I'm not sure. I think, I think everything. I actually haven't watched the talk in a few years, but I was looking at the slides a few minutes ago, and I think, absolutely everything that we mentioned in the slides, like the details have all changed. We're not using CF Engine anymore. We're using Terraform and Palami, and we're not, it's not IRC bots anymore. It's, Slack bots or Microsoft Team bots, and so everything has changed, but the fundamental principles, like if you squint at what we're talking about and kind of look at it through that was, 10 plus years ago, everything's changed a little bit, but those principles are still there. And, and I think one of the most gratifying things for me has been, it's not that John and I caused this, but watching every single one of those slides get turned into, entire conference talks where people have gone into a level of detail that I had never even considered when we were giving that talk. And, the amount of thinking that's gone into how we manage, how we prepare for failure, or how we think about learning environments, or, just the huge amount of work that's gone into monitoring and observability, and just this. And so, in some ways we talked about how graphs are important. In other ways, the world has changed totally thanks to the work of other people. And I think what we're seeing there is, people realizing that aspects of how they're working aren't working for them and coming up with better solutions that work for them, and then sharing those. And, it's part of a wider discourse around the industry. And I think that's what makes this such an interesting industry to work in. Right, John?
Yeah, Thomas and I were talking, a while ago about giving this talk, and one of the things that stuck out to me on the one hand, and I was looking through the slides as well. We're telling a story that has sort of different parts. We go into some detail in some parts, but for the most part, they're not. You couldn't take what we were talking about as prescriptions. They weren't recipes. They were descriptions, right? They were descriptions, and because there's only so much you can get into a 40-minute talk or whatever, however long it was. On the one hand, the thing that strikes me, there's one thing that I really appreciate, is that we gave that talk. Patrick, started DevOps Days that next year. Like Paul said, Andrew was at Velocity, gave very similar, very relevant, entirely connected talk. But notice that this wasn't planned. Flickr didn't set out to, we are going to do this thing. No, things that we thought, okay, there was nobody to tell us, or at least pre Yahoo acquisition, there was nobody to tell us that we couldn't do anything. But what strikes me is that this was, DevOps in general was a bottoms up, emergent set of ideas, collection of perspectives that were different than what came before, and is still continuing to generate new types of discussion, right? We didn't talk about, the three of us talked prior, that we didn't say anything about really. I mean, we did talk about continuous deployment, but none of the real details, right? Yeah. And then it was a later talk that Paul gave on trunk-based development that went, I think, much levels, a lot more into more detail. And so that's all, that's the stuff that gives me optimism for the future. And because this demonstration that ideas that are productive and can generate, real critical thinking when it comes to existing paradigms, status quo, all of that sort of thing is great. On the other hand, if I were to flip a little bit to be somewhat grumpy pants, is that there's, I think it also showed the industry that we can talk about ABC, XYZ, and say this worked for us. And other people take a little bit of Z and a little bit of Y, maybe none of X, and say, see, we're doing it. And not really do it. For example, one of the things that we didn't talk about, I think, in the talk, for probably a number of different reasons, developers at Flickr deployed their own code.
We actually did talk about that one.
Did we? Did we?
Yeah.
Well, but to this day, this still blows people's minds.
Yeah.
We have CI, we're running automated tests. Great. We've got a deployment system. Excellent. We've got monitoring of observability, blah, blah, blah. Therefore, we're doing DevOps. Okay. I'm not going to argue with you, but I will hear people who are saying, well, yeah, we're doing DevOps. The dev talks with ops about when their code is going to be ready so they can give it to ops to deploy. Not entirely. You got some stuff. So things can get mixed up, and there's no real Paul, what was the name of the paper?
Yeah, so I was going to say there's an amazing paper about this phenomenon. And basically, anytime you're looking at any new development in software engineering, I always think back to this paper. It's called Life Cycle of a Silver Bullet by a woman called Sarah Sherd. I hope I'm pronouncing her surname correctly. And she's one of those women that's been working in the industry, working on phenomenally important systems for years, but very few people have heard of her. She was building like air traffic control systems in the 90s kind of thing. But the basic idea of this paper is that you have a small group of people that are working on a particular problem that they have in the particular context that they're working on it. And they come up with some novel solution, some novel process, some novel tool. And they talk about it. And they talk about it with their friends and their colleagues at other companies. And it becomes this silver bullet. It becomes this thing that's going to save your team. It's going to mean you're going to deliver on time, on budget. You're going to have less outages. Everything's going to be amazing. Because they did see benefits for themselves. Some of their colleagues at other companies adopt this tool, see some of the benefits, start talking about it, and movement forms. But as the movement forms, people start applying it in contexts where it doesn't necessarily make sense. And they start applying watered down versions of it. And then the backlash starts. But at that point, it's become an established best practice that everyone should do. And so the CTO and the CIO are going to the DevOps conferences and insisting that their teams adopt DevOps practices. But they're not really engaging with the specific detail about the context and about how this specific technique worked for those teams. And then the backlash starts. And then a few years later, someone else working in a particular context starts to look at this process or this tool and says, this isn't quite working for me. What if we try this other thing? And then the cycle repeats. And so in some ways, DevOps is, the next iteration on the cycle that started with Agile and extreme programming and Scrum. It's just like a slightly different variation on the same set of ideas. But in other ways, we're starting to see that DevOps these days has become so watered down that I'm not sure anyone knows what it means when they say we're practicing DevOps. But that's probably okay because there are new ideas and new techniques that are coming up to take its place.
Right. And also, if we consider that that's a higher level set of concepts, right? Or as we're saying, this is what we did, but it just worked for us and that's it. Then the fact that it's watered down as much mean also that you can fit whatever works for you. Right? So that's maybe not that bad. It's just what happened when you accept this is what worked for us, find how if it works for you or not, and that's spread because they can pick whatever works for them.
And it gives people, particularly, line managers running small teams directly, the opportunity to actually start to adapt the techniques that are working for them while still listening to the CTO who says, well, we've got to adopt DevOps. Well, we are adopting DevOps. The problem is that for the managers that are less engaged with the specific context of the problems they're working on, it doesn't actually give them anything to improve. It doesn't give them a paint by numbers answer to how to solve their problems.
Exactly.
Yeah. It's also, so it's interesting also to me because, something that I hear sometimes the background in the DevOps community, but that I don't think has really stayed that visible up front. Something you talk about in the whole talk also is about how all of this is about enabling business. Is it something that you have seen developed, or something that you yourself have done more since then, or something you have changed mind?
I mean, I think about it a lot. I think the most important slide in our entire presentation was the slide that says the business requires change. And I think that's the one slide that I haven't seen a conference talk about how DevOps enables specific business change. And that's not, the DevOps research group people have been doing a lot of research that shows that teams that adopt DevOps practices tend to be high-performing teams and tend to deliver business outcomes. But I don't know if many people, I've not heard anyone talk about how they were running a service engineering team or they were running a reliability program and they talked to the sales and marketing teams to find out what the customers were saying. And I haven't heard anyone say, well, we spoke to our investors or we spoke to our investor relations team to find out what it is that our investors want. And, in bigger companies, that's probably not realistic. But I think everything we do needs to come back to what the business needs, how it's operating, who the customers are, and how we're solving problems for the end users of our software. And, that comes back to the context that the solutions that you'll come up with for how you deliver software are different if you're a bank versus a retailer versus, a charity or a government organization. And the cost of issues is much higher for some companies than for other companies. And when you're a startup, growth is everything, and new user acquisition and product iteration is incredibly important. But if you're a multinational hotel group, then you're not going to iterate on your core business model as quickly. And so the needs on the software change. And so, yeah, I think that that's one area that as an industry, we're still not as good as we should be about taking feedback from the people that are working with customers directly, but also thinking about how we fit into the wider goals of any given business.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, one of the things that that strikes me is on the one hand, you can go as a software engineer, you could work at one company that sells some sort of back office software to other companies. You could also then go work at some music or video streaming to consumers. And the difference is, on the one hand, you could see, well, yeah, I'm writing C. I'm writing C here. I'm writing C here. But the fact of the matter is that these businesses can be crazy, absolutely bananas different from one to another. And businesses have different uncertainties with them. Even so, startups, for example, like their uncertainty is this idea viable, right? The idea that we have viable, or an established, larger, growing company. Okay, it's viable. What's our uncertainty around? Well, maybe we're going to have competitors, right? What are those competitors going to be doing? How do we stay competitive? That sort of thing. And when I first met David Woods, he said, "What is this continuous deployment delivery? What is that? What's all those DevOps? What's all this about?" And I could sort of give him the sort of description, And his response to me was, John, what you've kind of described is this collection, feature flags and dark lunches and A/B tests and all of this sort of automated tests, all that stuff. He said, strikes me as a collection of hedges, right? You're hedging against some uncertainty or some, some quality of uncertainty. And I think he's right in that case, right? In the case of Flickr, we grew just absolutely bananas, over the time that Paul and I were there. And so we had to do a lot of under the covers, like a lot of user visible changes. And it made sense to have, config flags and all that sort of stuff, as hedges, right? Because in our situation, scaling the underlying sort of, substrate or infrastructure and all that sort of, stuff that wasn't really visible was what we needed to do. But somewhere else that might be different, Spotify, for example, that might be very, very different. You may have some benefits of working there, in that application, that business context, and have different uncertainties. And so that's what I keep coming back. And that's what fits for me on that. The business requires change. DevOps is about being clear, understanding what that change is, what does it mean, and how you can make it and how you can hedge against uncertainty around that change. But it's going to be different from business to business to business.
Yeah. And I think I'm going to actually go into the details on this a little bit more, because I think we're talking about things at very high level here in the same ways we did in our original presentation. Yeah. But there's two specific things. I think the first is that different companies have different restrictions around headcount or budgets in general, actually. How much money do you have to pay for the software that you use? How much money do you have to pay for the engineers that are working on your team? What is your headcount? And the solutions that you reach for are different if you're in a company that has more or less headcount available to you. How fast is your team growing? The processes that you reach for are different if your team is doubling in size every year versus if you're in a part of the business that's not a long-term priority and you know that your headcount is going to slowly decrease 10% every year. And then I think also that, ties into the buy versus build conversation, that we as an industry still are just terrible about thinking about the trade-offs of buying something off the shelf that will do 90% of what you need it to versus building something that is absolutely perfect, but is going to take 18 months to deliver. And that's something I'm personally still working on myself. I still reach for a text editor when there's a perfectly good enough piece of software over there and yeah, these are just two areas that I think that we could be doing more on as an industry, is to talk about the trade-offs that we're making and how they affect the bottom line and the top line for the companies that we're working for.
Right. Yeah, I think there is something to tie both of this perspective here, which is like practically every change and every decision we take about buy versus build, right, is a bet, right? We are betting on what the future is going to be and what the impact is going to be. And so, and on one side, we can hedge this bet, right? And try to make it so that we can hedge so that if the downside, we don't have it too much, especially with changes. But with build versus buy, it's still really hard sometimes to hedge that decision and also to really just understand what we are getting into, right? This is an estimation problem, but not only, right? It's really, really hard still for all of us we look at the price of the solution we could buy and we're like, yeah, that's really expensive. I don't want to do that. While sometimes something I've seen a lot is that I don't think a lot of discussion of, dev accounting, right? Where not only DevOps, but dev accounting, where we could go talk to the accountant, and financial people, that's their job to do this kind of estimation and to work with them. And I don't see that happen so much, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you know, so in a lot of companies now, the AWS bill is kind of third after salaries and offices as the biggest. So I think, you know, there are many, many companies where the technical operations teams are engaging with accounting. But I think for a lot of teams, it's easier to the the workload, the task list of an individual engineer is something that the manager feels like they have control over. So it's easy to say, go build this. Whereas, you know, the procurement process and, you know, understanding what the limits of what you can expense on a credit card is something that a lot of companies aren't great at explaining to their frontline managers. And so it's one of those things where the build versus buy can be influenced just by the fact that people don't know how to buy the software. I don't know, John, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I mean, I don't. I think that you've nailed it. I would say that, I would say that there are, there's something about understanding what software you're actually using, especially when it comes to software, for example, monitoring, or let's call it sort of telemetry, right? It's quite easy for VP of engineering or CTO to say, "Oh, we should. I read this article, and we should use this thing that was in the article, and let's use this service. We'll buy it, and they'll put it in place." Are people using it? Is actually a surprisingly hard question to answer. And so, of course, I mean, there's other software services that and there's no other option. I mean, you have to be using it, right? But yeah.
It's an interesting point, right? Because like, it's not only like the tool, but it's also like, we could define all these metrics, right? All this telemetry, like, will they be used? Like, do we check if they are used and useful to people? And that's something we see also with alerts, right? With all kind of things like that, which is, or even more recently, I asked in my company, like, can we know if people read the postmortem that we have for incidents? And no one knows, right? There is no way to know, in this particular case at least. So it's interesting that we want to have all this data, right? About, we are testing, we are doing feature flags to check if it works well or not for our features, for our product, but we don't really do that for our tools.
It feels like this is something that every single monitoring or telemetry system should give you a free report, which is the number of independent engineers that have looked at any given dashboard or any given metric in the last. But, you know, but I also, you know, that only matters if you're cost constrained on your budget for monitoring software. And if you've got a piece of monitoring software that's just sitting there collecting metrics that's not being used, but the company doesn't care about money because they've got more money than they know how to spend anyway, that's fine. On the other hand, if you're the kind of company where margin is everything and you're trying to keep your costs constrained, then that's something that's worth spending, you know, a few days, a few weeks looking into. But again, it all depends on the context, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, we are coming back to, you know, talk with your finance people to see if that's an investment worth your time. Right. But I mean, it's interesting because the other thing I was saying in that talk, right, and something we have seen quite a lot in the DevOps movement, is to talk about the impact of operating, but also about developing how bad of an experience it was with this wall between, right? How you have feelings that the other side was a prick, and how you were having an atrocious time with all this software crashing all the time, waking you up and all. So, like, have we done any progress in that?
I think it depends. I certainly would like to think so. You know, I worked at Etsy for about 7 years. I left Flickr to go work at Etsy. There's an engineer at Etsy, we hired a lot of interns, right? Interns would come and in fact, I think we hired as many interns as we possibly could. At some point, even also 2010 was when I started at Etsy. Continuous deployment was very, very exotic, novel. In fact, quite a lot of people didn't even really believe it was possible even back then. And then a couple of years go by and then it became clear, like, wait, these interns this is their first job and they're deploying their own. We did a lot, if not all, of the things that we did at Flickr. They've never known it any other way. They've never known the situation where, you release the code once every 2 or 3 weeks or a month or a quarter, and you write the code and then it goes, somebody takes it off your hands. And does stuff with it, and you'll hear back when it goes to production, right? That's it. But you don't really know because you're off on the new thing. And, I don't know. I kind of almost don't want new engineers to know what that world was like. I'm already embarrassed it took us this long to come up with continuous deployment.
Yeah, I think there were bits in the talk where we were talking about, not hiding things from other people and being honest when you make mistakes. And I kind of look at that now and I think I haven't worked in an environment where that's relevant advice for 15 years. But I know that there are environments that are political like that are out there. And I don't know if I were working in one of those environments, I'd find another job. But they absolutely do exist. And I think that, and so it's so easy to assume that some of the advice we were giving there is no longer relevant. But I'm sure that it must be. I'm sure there are still companies that operate in those ways.
Yeah.
I mean, there is a piece of advice about using the same version control system for dev on ops, which is probably not that useful today because nearly everyone is on Git, but probably there are some companies still using other distributed control systems that may be different for dev on ops.
I think there are a lot of companies where Slack was one, for example, where the operations team had a different Git repository than the development teams. And it was not always clear to developers. There were very few developers that contributed to both sets of repos. And I think that's a very common pattern. Yes, everyone's still using Git, but that doesn't tell you what do all the, pre-merge checks look like, and what happens after you've merged. Does it automatically deploy? Is there a button you need to press somewhere? Do you need to run a command? That kind of documentation is not always clear. But yeah, I mean,
yeah. One of the things that this brings up is, and actually, Paul, let me ask you, was there anything that was preventing? I get your point that there wasn't, a lot of document. Was there anything that was preventing explicitly people who weren't in operations from seeing what was in the repo?
No, the repo was public. Yeah. Well, internally public. Yeah. You did have to have, certain permissions to actually deploy changes. Sure,
but you could see it. You could read it.
Yeah, and there was a process for engineers to go through to get those permissions.
And I think that is an important sort of aspect of what we were talking about in the talk in 2009 was and my colleague Richard Cook has pointed out, it's more about the ability. It's about investing in an ability and sustaining that ability to do things. In one case, deploy, right? It's less about how many times you deploy. Than it is, you could deploy if you needed to. You could read what's going on in the chef repo in a distant part of the organization over there. And it sounds like a sort of a minor sort of nuanced perspective, but I think it's really, really important.
Yeah, and I think, actually going back to the politics thing that I was talking about earlier, if everything's open, then there's much less space to hide. Someone's gonna work it out eventually, and you're not going to be able to hide the fact that you pushed the change that caused the outage to happen. So you may as well be open about that, because everyone's going to see it anyway.
Yeah. And when you are in the position of writing code, making changes in production, there's a little bit of a reciprocal, almost like a implicit reciprocation that happened. Think about code review, right? You asked me to review your code. Well, I'm not gonna, or at least personally, I'm not gonna phone it in, because I want you to pay attention when I ask you. And so there's a very sort of reciprocal scenario. I'm sure it goes wrong all the time. However, I think that plays into this. Like, you know what? Make it available so that people can understand what the hell is actually being, and in that way, the focus is no longer, ideally, the focus is no longer on the author. It's on the code.
Yeah.
That's a one view.
I think it also opens up the possibility for people to learn more about how the system works. Yes. The number of times that I've understood how something's worked by going and spending an evening by myself digging into the code and trying to understand what it's doing. Even in systems that I don't really understand how it all fits together, but and I know that not everyone has the opportunity, the time, the ability to do that, but at least making it possible. It's no substitute for actual training programs and onboarding programs and so on, but the fact that is possible does open up some opportunities for people to learn more about how different parts of the company work.
Mm-hmm. Okay. It's really useful to, we can't train for everything, right? There's always things that we don't understand fully in our system. So being able to go in and being able to tease out what's happening, it's really something that helps us to make it work. Okay, we are slowly reaching the end of our time together. So I'm going to leave you both 1 minute if you want to talk about, I'm not going to talk to you about what you expect for the future 10 years, because that's definitely not something I expect anyone in this industry to get right. But what is your focus after these 10 years and your evolution since then in how what you see and how you act in the industry? What are the things that are fully on your mind today to try to change and to work on? Paul, maybe?
Yeah, I'm happy to go first. I think that we as an industry still haven't quite got to the bottom of the best way to run a pager rotation and all the things that are relating to how services are run out of hours. And, there's this notion of you build it, you run it. That's a fundamentally exclusionary way of running a business. There are so many people, not least new parents, who just cannot be on a pager rotation every single evening for a week. People who have volunteer commitments on weekends can't be on call on the weekends. And that ties into another thing that I think one of the things we did with DevOps, it went from, well, let's burn out the ops team to, well, let's burn out all of the engineers with unrealistic expectations about how we run software. And I think, there's a lot to explore there, but something around how we actually move to a place where it's possible for you to run an online service without burning out individuals, and how to sustain that kind of velocity of change over time without just relying on individual heroics and people giving more to their work than they necessarily want to. Yeah.
Thanks, Paul. John?
Yeah, I would have to say that, let's see, how could I put this succinctly? Two things stick out to me as being, I think, warrant attention and are important to me, which are how difficult it is for engineers to understand what is actually happening. We talk quite a good deal about mental models and reasoning about systems, and that needs more attention. That I think that continues. We talked about hedging earlier. You only hedge in situations where you're unsure, right? And the other thing that kind of goes along with that is helping engineers tell stories about what's difficult. This is difficult work. It's not going to get easier. It's not going to get simpler. It's only going to get more complex. And a great deal of what it means to become and work as a software engineer of any sort in any speciality is that you will face difficulties in understanding what's happening, understanding what's needed in writing new code, all of that sort of thing. But we don't have stories about what's what makes things difficult. I guess the last thing that kind of maybe underscores that is this notion of the idea that we could think of the software that supposedly is supposed to help us, as a teammate. If they were like a member of your team, no one would like them. They're terrible, right? They'd be the worst. The software we write would make the worst teammates. And we have to improve on that front. And the first way we start doing that is to understand what makes things difficult and then help the software help us in handling those.
Yeah, I feel like we're still in such the early days of trying to understand how software is built and developed. It feels like we're at the point where we've just discovered steam power. And soon someone's about to discover electricity, but we still haven't even thought about reconfiguring how our factories work and there's, before you even get into the safety aspects and the entire industrialization of that. And there's so much more work to be done here, and I'm really excited to see, who comes next in saying, well, here's this little thing that we tried at this little company that we're working on. And everyone goes, wow, we need to do that too. Like that's one of the best things about our industry. And I'm really looking forward to seeing what the next version of that is.
You're out there.
Yeah.
Just give the talk.
Yeah.
Yeah. All of you, come give the talk. You will probably come from a different corner of the industry that people already give talks, so come do it. Okay, so on that, our time together is finished. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, John, for accepting to do this. I hope that both of you and also everyone that is watching is having a pretty great conference, and see you next time.
Thanks. Thank you very much.
Thank you.